Mark had always considered himself a friendly neighbor. He lived in a quiet suburban area where everyone knew each other by name, exchanged pleasantries over the fence, and occasionally borrowed tools or shared homegrown vegetables. His backyard shed, once just a storage space for his lawnmower and gardening supplies, had recently undergone an upgrade. Mark had installed solar panels on his roof and set up a small charging station inside the shed. It was practical, eco-friendly, and perfect for keeping his phone charged during outdoor projects, or so he thought. At first, everything seemed fine. The solar panels worked efficiently, cutting down his electricity bills significantly. Then one sunny afternoon, Karen appeared at his door with her electric golf cart parked outside. She smiled brightly as she asked, "Hey, Mark, do you mind if I charge my golf cart here? I'm having some trouble with my outlet at home." Mark hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Sure, go ahead," he said, figuring it wouldn't hurt to help out a neighbor in need. After all, what harm could come from letting someone use his shed for a quick charge? Karen thanked him profusely, promising it would only be a one-time thing. But days turned into weeks, and soon one time became a daily occurrence. Every morning, like clockwork, Karen would roll up with her golf cart, plug it in, and leave without asking permission anymore. At first, Mark didn't think much of it. He told himself that being neighborly meant helping others when they needed it. Besides, how much energy could a golf cart really use? But as time went on, subtle signs began to bother him. His electricity bill, which should have been lower thanks to the solar panels, started creeping back up. The outlet in the shed felt warmer than usual after hours of use, and he noticed wear and tear on the charger itself. More importantly, there was something about Karen's behavior that rubbed him the wrong way. She never offered to pay for the electricity, nor did she seem particularly grateful. Instead, she acted as if using his shed was her right, not a favor. Mark tried dropping hints to make Karen reconsider her routine. One day, while she was plugging in her cart, he casually mentioned, "You know, these solar panels are great, but they still cost money to maintain." He hoped she'd catch his drift, maybe offer to chip in or at least acknowledge his generosity. But Karen simply nodded absently and replied, "Oh yeah, I bet they're amazing. Thanks again for letting me charge here." And just like that, she walked away, leaving Mark standing there, feeling both annoyed and powerless. The situation grew worse when Karen stopped knocking on his door altogether. Now, she'd show up whenever it suited her, early mornings, late evenings, even weekends when Mark wanted to relax in peace. Each time, she'd park her cart near the shed, plug it in, and disappear back into her house as though nothing unusual was happening. Sometimes, she'd leave little notes taped to the shed door. "Thanks for letting me charge again," or "Your solar setup is awesome." These messages came across less like gratitude and more like reminders that she expected him to keep accommodating her. Mark couldn't shake the growing resentment building inside him. He prided himself on being helpful, but this felt different. Karen wasn't treating him like a kind neighbor. She was acting entitled, as if his resources existed solely for her convenience. Yet, despite his frustration, Mark struggled to confront her directly. He hated conflict and worried that saying something might damage their relationship, or worse, create unnecessary drama in the neighborhood. So he stayed silent, silently fuming every time he saw her golf cart parked outside his shed. Little did Karen know, her actions were about to push Mark to his breaking point and inspire him to take matters into his own hands. As the days stretched into weeks, Mark's frustration with Karen began to simmer just below the surface. At first, he tried convincing himself that it wasn't a big deal, just a minor inconvenience. After all, neighbors were supposed to help each other out, right? But the more he thought about it, the harder it became to ignore how Karen's behavior was affecting him. What started as an occasional favor had turned into a daily intrusion, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was being taken advantage of. Karen's visits grew increasingly brazen. She no longer bothered knocking on his door or even acknowledging him when she arrived. Instead, she'd pull up in her golf cart, park it near the shed, and plug it in without so much as a hello. Sometimes she'd hum a cheerful tune while doing it, as though she didn't have a care in the world. Other times, she'd glance around briefly to see if Mark was watching, but she never said a word. It was almost as if she believed the shed, and everything in it, belonged to her now. The notes she left behind only added fuel to Mark's growing irritation. They weren't heartfelt expressions of gratitude. They were perfunctory scribbles meant to justify her actions. "Thanks for letting me charge again," one note read, accompanied by a hastily drawn smiley face. Another said, "You're such a good neighbor," but the tone felt insincere, like she was mocking him rather than thanking him. Each time Mark found one of these notes taped to his shed door, he felt a mix of anger and disbelief. Did Karen really think a few words on a piece of paper made up for her constant use of his property? What bothered Mark most was how Karen refused to acknowledge the impact of her actions. When he finally mustered the courage to bring up the topic, she dismissed his concerns with vague excuses. One evening, as she was leaving her golf cart plugged in yet again, Mark approached her and said, "Hey, Karen, I've noticed you've been using the shed quite a bit lately. Just wanted to check if everything's okay with your outlet at home." Karen laughed lightly, brushing off his comment. "Oh, don't worry about it," she replied. "Your solar panels are probably saving you tons of money anyway. It's not like you're paying extra for this, right?" Her casual attitude stunned him. How could she act so entitled? Mark stared at her, searching for any sign of remorse. But there was none. She genuinely believed she was doing nothing wrong. Mark's patience began to wear thin. He started noticing small details that he hadn't paid attention to before. The faint hum of the charger running late into the night. The faint smell of overheated wires lingering in the air. The way Karen avoided eye contact whenever he mentioned her frequent visits. He even caught her sneaking over early one morning, long before he expected anyone to be awake. Watching her through the window, Mark realized something unsettling. Karen wasn't just using his shed because she needed to. She was using it because she could. Still, Mark hesitated to confront her directly. He didn't want to come across as rude or unneighborly, especially since their shared driveway made avoiding each other nearly impossible. But the tension between them continued to build, bubbling beneath the surface like a pot ready to boil over. Every time Karen parked her golf cart outside his shed, Mark felt a fresh wave of annoyance wash over him. He knew he couldn't keep letting her walk all over him, but what could he do? One night, lying awake in bed, Mark replayed the situation in his mind. He imagined telling Karen exactly how he felt, laying out all the ways her behavior had inconvenienced him. In his fantasy, she apologized profusely and promised to stop using his shed immediately. But deep down, Mark knew that wouldn't happen. Karen wasn't the type to admit fault or change her ways, not without some kind of push. And that's when an idea began to form in his head. If Karen wouldn't listen to reason, maybe it was time to find another way to get his point across. Something clever, something subtle, something that would force her to realize just how much she relied on him and make her rethink her habits once and for all. Mark spent the next few days turning over ideas in his mind. He knew he couldn't keep letting Karen take advantage of him, but direct confrontation felt like a minefield. She was stubborn, and Mark wasn't confident that a straightforward conversation would solve anything. If anything, it might escalate into an argument, or worse, make their already strained relationship unbearable. No, he needed something smarter, subtler, something that would send a clear message without causing unnecessary drama. One evening, after another long day of work, Mark retreated to his workshop. It was his favorite place to unwind, filled with tools, spare parts, and half-finished projects. As he tinkered with a broken lamp, inspiration struck him. His eyes landed on an old timer switch he'd picked up months ago from a garage sale. At the time, he hadn't known what to do with it. But now, its purpose seemed crystal clear. A slow smile spread across his face as he began sketching out a plan. The idea was simple yet effective. He would rig the outlet in his shed with the timer switch, Instead of providing continuous power, the outlet would only stay active for 3 seconds before cutting off automatically. 3 seconds, that was just enough time to prevent someone from charging a device, but not long enough to cause any real damage. It was a harmless prank, really, designed to inconvenience rather than harm. The brilliance of it lay in its simplicity. If Karen tried to charge her golf cart, she quickly realized something was wrong, but she wouldn't be able to prove who or what was behind it. Excited by his newfound solution, Mark got to work immediately. He rummaged through his toolbox, gathering everything he needed: the timer switch, some wiring, and a small circuit board to fine-tune the timing mechanism. For hours, he sat hunched over his workbench, carefully connecting wires and testing the setup. Every so often, he'd glance toward the shed, imagining Karen's reaction when she discovered her golf cart wasn't charging properly. Would she suspect foul play, or would she assume it was just a random malfunction? By midnight, the project was complete. Mark stood back, admiring his handiwork. The modified outlet looked exactly the same as before, with no visible signs of tampering. To anyone unaware of the changes, it would appear perfectly normal until they tried using it. That is, satisfied with his creation, Mark carried it out to the shed and installed it, double-checking to ensure everything worked as intended. When he flipped the breaker back on, the outlet hummed softly, ready to spring into action. As he locked up the shed and headed back inside, Mark felt a strange mix of guilt and satisfaction. On one hand, he knew this wasn't the most mature way to handle the situation. But on the other hand, Karen had left him with no choice. Short of outright banning her from using his property and risking a heated confrontation, this seemed like the best option. Besides, he reasoned, it wasn't malicious. If anything, it was a wake-up call. Maybe, just maybe, Karen would finally understand how much she relied on him and reconsider her behavior. That night, as Mark drifted off to sleep, he replayed the scenario in his head. He pictured Karen showing up the next morning with her usual cheerful demeanor, only to find her golf cart refusing to charge. Would she storm over to demand answers? Or would she quietly slink away, embarrassed at having been caught red-handed? Either way, Mark knew one thing for certain: things were about to get interesting. For weeks, Karen had treated his shed like her personal charging station. Now it was his turn to take control and see how she responded when the tables were turned. The next morning, Mark woke up earlier than usual, his heart racing with anticipation. He peeked out of his bedroom window, half expecting to see Karen already parked outside his shed. But the driveway was empty, and for a moment, he wondered if she'd somehow sensed his little modification and decided to skip her daily ritual. The thought made him chuckle. There was no way Karen could have known. She was far too confident in her routine to suspect anything was amiss. By mid-morning, the sound of tires crunching against gravel confirmed that Karen hadn't changed her plans after all. Mark watched from behind the curtains as she pulled up in her golf cart, humming softly to herself. She didn't even glance toward his house before hopping out and heading straight for the shed. With practiced ease, she plugged in the charger and gave the cord a quick tug to make sure it was secure. Then, without so much as a backward glance, she strolled back to her house, leaving the cart to charge as usual. Mark waited a few minutes, curiosity getting the better of him. Quietly, he slipped into his backyard and stood near the shed, listening intently. Sure enough, the faint hum of electricity buzzed through the air, but only for 3 seconds. Then, just as programmed, the power cut off with a nearly imperceptible click. Mark smiled to himself, satisfied that his invention was working exactly as intended. Now came the real test. How would Karen react when she discovered her golf cart wasn't charging? Hours passed, and Mark went about his day, stealing glances out the window whenever he could. Finally, late in the afternoon, Karen reappeared. This time, her demeanor was different. Gone was the carefree humming. Instead, she wore a puzzled frown as she approached the shed. Mark ducked out of sight, but kept watching closely. He saw her inspect the charger, unplugging, and replugging it several times in quick succession. Each attempt ended the same way. The power stayed on for precisely 3 seconds before cutting out again. Karen's frustration grew visibly. She knelt down beside the outlet, examining it as though searching for some hidden flaw. When that didn't work, she jiggled the cord, tapped the charger, and even flipped the breaker switch inside the shed. Nothing changed. The outlet remained stubbornly uncooperative, delivering its brief burst of power before shutting down once more. After several failed attempts, Karen finally gave up, muttering under her breath as she marched toward Mark's front door. When she knocked, Mark took a deep breath and opened the door, feigning surprise. "Hey, Karen," he said casually. "Everything okay?" Karen didn't bother with pleasantries. "Your outlet isn't working," she blurted out, pointing toward the shed. "I've been trying to charge my golf cart all day, and it keeps turning off after a couple of seconds. Do you know what's going on?" Mark shrugged, doing his best to look innocent. That's odd. I haven't had any issues with it. Maybe there's something wrong with your charger, or maybe there's been a surge or something." Karen frowned, clearly unconvinced. "It was fine yesterday," she insisted. "And the day before that. Why would it suddenly stop working now?" "I'm not sure," Mark replied, keeping his tone light. "But if you want, I can take a look later. Could be a loose connection or something." For a moment, Karen hesitated, studying him suspiciously. Mark held her gaze, careful not to betray any hint of guilt. Eventually, she sighed and shook her head. "Fine. Whatever. Just let me know if you figure it out." Without another word, she turned and walked back to her house, leaving Mark standing in the doorway, trying hard not to grin. As soon as she was gone, Mark allowed himself a small laugh. Phase 1 of his plan had worked perfectly. Karen was confused, frustrated, and, most importantly, starting to question whether using his shed was worth the trouble. But this was only the beginning. If she kept pushing her luck, Mark knew he'd have to step things up a notch. For now, though, he was content to sit back and watch how the situation unfolded. One thing was certain: Karen wouldn't give up easily, and that meant the game was far from over. Over the next few days, Karen's frustration only deepened. She didn't give up as Mark had half expected her to. Instead, she became determined to solve the mystery of the malfunctioning outlet. Every morning, like clockwork, she'd roll up in her golf cart, plug it in, and wait for something, anything, to change. But no matter how many times she tried, the result was always the same: 3 seconds of power, followed by silence. At first, Karen seemed convinced that the problem lay with her own equipment. She brought out a different charger one day, then a spare battery the next. Each time, she tested them meticulously, plugging and unplugging with growing irritation. When none of these fixes worked, she began inspecting the shed itself. Mark watched from his kitchen window as she poked around the circuit breaker, tapped on the walls, and even peered at the solar panel connections outside. Her movements were sharp and deliberate, betraying her mounting annoyance. But it wasn't just her actions that caught Mark's attention. It was the notes she started leaving behind. At first, they were simple reminders scrawled on scraps of paper. "Your outlet still isn't working. Read one," taped crookedly to the shed door. Another said, "Can you check this soon? It's really inconvenient." The tone of these messages grew sharper with each passing day. One particularly pointed note read, "If you don't want me using your shed anymore, all you have to do is say so." Mark couldn't help but smirk at the irony. Of course, he didn't want her using his shed, but not because of any personal grudge. He simply wanted her to respect his boundaries and stop treating his property like her personal charging station. Yet, instead of addressing the real issue, Karen continued to act as though the problem was entirely his fault. In her mind, it seemed, Mark was obligated to provide her with free electricity, and anything less was unacceptable. Despite her increasingly passive-aggressive tactics, Mark stayed calm. He left the notes untouched, letting them accumulate on the shed door like a silent testament to Karen's stubbornness. Occasionally, he'd glance at them while working in the yard, shaking his head at the absurdity of the situation. If Karen thought guilt-tripping him would make him cave, she clearly didn't know him very well. By the fourth day, Karen's patience appeared to be wearing thin. That afternoon, she stormed over to Mark's house, her face flushed with anger. "What's going on with your outlet?" she demanded, planting herself firmly in front of him. "It keeps turning off after a few seconds. Are you messing with me?" Mark raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. "Messing with you? Why would I do that? I told you I haven't noticed any problems. Have you tried calling an electrician? Maybe there's something wrong with your cart." Karen crossed her arms, glaring at him. "Don't play dumb, Mark. This isn't a coincidence. Someone tampered with that outlet, and we both know it." Her accusation hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. For a moment, Mark considered denying everything. But then, almost instinctively, he decided to push back, just enough to throw her off balance. "Funny thing," he said slowly, leaning against the doorway. "I did install a safety feature recently. You know, to prevent overuse. Seems like it might be affecting certain devices." Karen's eyes widened in disbelief. Asterisk safety feature asterisk. Really? Since when do you need a safety feature for an outlet? What kind of nonsense is that? "It's not nonsense," Mark replied evenly. "People can overload outlets if they use them too much. I figured it was better to be safe than sorry." Karen stared at him, her jaw tightening. She clearly didn't believe his explanation, but she also couldn't argue with it. After all, what could she say? That she'd been using his outlet nonstop for weeks without permission. Admitting that would mean acknowledging her own behavior, and Karen wasn't about to do that. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Karen let out a huff of exasperation. "Fine," she snapped. "Do whatever you want, but don't expect me to keep coming here if you're going to pull stunts like this." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back to her house, slamming the door behind her. As Mark watched her go, he felt a strange mix of relief and satisfaction. Karen hadn't backed down completely, but she'd finally acknowledged that something was off. More importantly, she'd realized, albeit reluctantly, that Mark wasn't going to let her walk all over him anymore. Whether she liked it or not, things were changing. And while Mark knew Karen wouldn't give up easily, he also knew he'd taken the first step toward reclaiming control of his space. The days that followed Karen's heated confrontation with Mark were tense, but telling. For the first time in weeks, her golf cart didn't appear outside his shed each morning. Instead, Mark noticed it parked haphazardly in her driveway, as if she'd given up on charging it altogether, or at least for now. At first, he wondered if she'd finally taken the hint and decided to invest in her own solution. But knowing Karen, he doubted it would be that simple. Karen's absence from his property didn't mean she'd let the issue drop entirely. If anything, she seemed more determined than ever to prove her point, or get revenge. One afternoon, Mark heard a loud buzzing noise coming from the direction of her backyard. Curious, he peeked over the fence and saw Karen standing near a tangled mess of extension cords and power strips. She was attempting to create some kind of makeshift charging setup, running wires from her house all the way to where her golf cart sat parked. The sight was comical, almost absurd, but Mark couldn't help feeling a pang of guilt. Maybe he pushed things too far. Still, any sympathy he felt quickly faded when Karen began leaving new notes on his porch. These weren't the passive-aggressive scribbles from before. They were outright accusatory. "You're punishing me because I use your outlet," one read. Another said, "If you wanted me to stop, you should have just said so instead of playing games." Each note came across as an attempt to make him feel guilty, but Mark refused to budge. He knew deep down that Karen wasn't upset about the outlet itself. She was upset because she'd lost access to something she'd come to rely on without permission. One evening, unable to resist, Mark decided to test the waters. He walked over to Karen's yard, under the pretense of borrowing a tool, hoping to gauge her mood. As soon as she saw him approaching, Her expression hardened. "What do you want?" she asked sharply, not bothering to hide her irritation. "I just wanted to see how you're doing," Mark replied, keeping his tone light. "Haven't seen your golf cart around lately." Karen snorted. "Oh, right. Because someone decided to sabotage my only option for charging it. Thanks for asking." Mark sighed, deciding to take a slightly different approach. "Look, Karen, I never meant for this to turn into a big deal. But you have to admit, using my shed every single day wasn't exactly fair to me. I've got bills to pay, too, you know." For a moment, Karen looked like she might argue. Her lips parted, then closed again as though she couldn't find the words. Finally, she muttered, "It's not like I was asking for much, just a little electricity. You act like I was draining your entire system." "That's not the point," Mark countered gently. "The point is, you didn't ask, you just took. And when I tried to bring it up, you brushed it off like it wasn't a big deal." Karen crossed her arms, looking away. She didn't respond, but Mark could tell his words had hit home. For the first time since the conflict began, there was a flicker of self-awareness in her expression. It wasn't quite remorse, but it was close enough to give him hope. The conversation ended awkwardly, with neither of them saying much else. As Mark walked back to his house, he realized something important. Karen might not have apologized outright, but she hadn't denied his accusations either. That small admission, that unspoken acknowledgement, was progress. Over the next few days, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Karen stopped leaving notes, and her golf cart remained parked in her driveway. Whether she'd found another way to charge it or simply accepted defeat, Mark didn't know, and truthfully, he didn't care. What mattered was that the constant intrusion had finally stopped. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace and control over his own space. But as Mark sat on his porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he couldn't shake the thought that Karen might still harbor resentment. People like Karen didn't forgive easily, or forget. Still, Mark reminded himself that he'd done what he needed to do. Sometimes, standing up for yourself meant risking tension, even fallout, with others. And while he hoped Karen had learned a lesson about respect and boundaries, he also knew that not everyone changed overnight. For now, though, he was content to enjoy the quiet and trust that the timer in his shed would stay ready, just in case. Weeks passed, and life in the neighborhood returned to its usual rhythm, or at least as close to it as possible. Karen's golf cart no longer appeared outside Mark's shed, and the once frequent notes on his porch had stopped altogether. The tension between them eased, though it didn't disappear completely. When they crossed paths, their interactions were polite but distant. A quick nod or a generic, "How's it going?" was about as far as either of them ventured into conversation. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough for Mark. He'd reclaimed his peace and his property. Karen, for her part, seemed to have moved on. One day, Mark noticed a new charging station installed in her backyard. It wasn't fancy or particularly high-tech, but it got the job done. Her golf cart was back in action, zipping around the neighborhood with its usual quiet hum. Watching from his window, Mark couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. Whether she'd bought it out of necessity or sheer stubbornness, he didn't know. And frankly, it didn't matter. What mattered was that Karen had finally taken responsibility for her own needs instead of relying on him. Despite the resolution, Mark found himself reflecting on the entire ordeal more often than he expected. It wasn't just about Karen or the golf cart. It was about boundaries, respect, and the delicate balance of neighborly relationships. He realized now that being kind didn't mean letting people take advantage of you. There was a difference between generosity and enabling, and he'd learned that lesson the hard way. While he still valued being helpful and friendly, he also understood the importance of setting limits and enforcing them when necessary. The timer switch in the shed stayed exactly where it was, untouched and ready to serve its purpose if needed. Mark liked knowing it was there, not because he expected another conflict, but because it gave him a sense of control. If Karen ever decided to test him again, he'd be prepared. But deep down, he doubted she would. For all her flaws, Karen wasn't one to repeat mistakes that made her look foolish, or worse, dependent. As the weeks turned into months, Mark noticed subtle changes in Karen's behavior toward him. She began waving more warmly when they saw each other, even going so far as to bring over a plate of cookies one afternoon. "Just thought I'd share," she said with a tight smile, leaving before Mark could respond. He accepted the gesture for what it was, a small olive branch, and thanked her sincerely. Whether it was guilt, gratitude, or simply an attempt to smooth things over, Mark didn't dwell on it. All that mattered was that the air between them felt lighter, less charged with resentment. Looking back, Mark knew the situation could have gone differently. He might have caved to Karen's demands, allowing her to use his shed indefinitely and silently resenting her for it. Or he might have escalated the confrontation, turning a minor disagreement into a full-blown feud. Instead, he'd chosen a middle path, one that allowed him to assert himself without burning bridges. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. In the end, Mark came away from the experience with a renewed appreciation for standing up for himself, and a reminder that sometimes the best solutions are the ones born out of creativity and patience. He didn't hold any ill will toward Karen. After all, everyone makes mistakes. What mattered was how they grew from them. As for Mark, he felt stronger, wiser, and more confident in his ability to handle challenges, whether they involved nosy neighbors or malfunctioning outlets. And so, life went on. The shed remained locked most days, its modified outlet standing as a quiet testament to Mark's ingenuity and resolve. Occasionally, he'd glance at it while working in the yard, chuckling softly at the memory of Karen's frustrated face. It was a story he'd never forget, and one he hoped Karen wouldn't either. After all, sometimes the best lessons are the ones we learn the hard way.